In this video, follow the story of Camila, a black woman who faces humiliation and racism at work from her boss. After much resilience and struggle, she transforms her life and becomes the leader everyone admires. This is an inspiring account of how determination can lead to leadership and justice. Camila sat at her desk, reviewing the final reports of the day. She had been working at the company for almost 4 years, always giving her best. She started as an assistant, had been promoted once, and now, as an analyst, she dreamed of climbing even higher. She knew she had the potential, but it felt like something was holding her back. That something had a name: Arthur, her direct boss. Ever since he took over the department 2 years ago, Camila felt like her work was no longer recognized. Arthur never missed a chance to belittle her and make offensive jokes. That morning, he had called a team meeting to discuss a new marketing campaign. Camila had prepared a detailed presentation full of data-driven insights, something that could take the company to a new level. When it was her turn to speak, she was nervous but confident in the content she had developed. However, Arthur seemed determined to undermine her from the start. "Camila, interesting idea, but does it really show market vision?" He interrupted early in her presentation, a smug smile on his face. "You do understand how this industry works, right?" The room fell silent. Her colleagues glanced at her briefly, but no one said a word. Camila felt a knot forming in her stomach. She tried to continue her presentation, but Arthur kept interrupting. Every point she made was ridiculed, as if nothing she said mattered. "Look, I'm not sure if you have enough experience to tackle this issue, Camila. Maybe we should leave this to someone with a bit more know-how." His words dripped with condescension. Camila closed her slides and sat down, her face burning with shame. Her colleagues, visibly uncomfortable, avoided eye contact, pretending to be busy on their phones or laptops. No one dared to challenge Arthur. He was known for being ruthless with those who opposed him, and his power over the team was clear. The meeting continued, and the ideas she had worked so hard to present were either ignored or reassigned to others. When the meeting ended, Camila went to the restroom. She locked herself in one of the stalls, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. Why doesn't anyone do anything, she thought. She knew it wasn't just her competence being questioned. Arthur's racism was subtle but always present, hidden in jokes and veiled comments. She recalled an occasion a few months back when Arthur, in a joking tone, said, "You should be more grateful for the opportunity, right? You know chances out there aren't the same for, well, everyone." Each day, the emotional toll was mounting. The racism, though disguised, was a constant presence in her work life. And the worst part, there was nowhere to turn. Human resources was under Arthur's control, and everyone knew that any complaint would be silenced or, worse, used against the person who made it. Camila had thought about reporting him, but she knew that her word against his would carry little weight. He had influence and a network of connections that would protect him. That night, Camila returned home utterly exhausted. Her mind was racing and her body felt heavy. As she tried to relax on the couch, Arthur's words echoed in her mind, slowly chipping away at her confidence. Despair crept in. She felt trapped in a cycle of humiliation that seemed never-ending. Even though she knew she had talent, it was as if she was always one step behind, unable to break through the invisible barrier Arthur had placed in front of her. The next morning, when she arrived at the office, Camila found a pile of documents on her desk, with a note pinned on top. "I need this by the end of the day. Arthur." She knew it was impossible to finish the task within the given deadline. He was doing it on purpose. Arthur loved to see her struggle with impossible deadlines, only to point out her failures and incompetence afterward. She sighed and started working. As she typed, Arthur's voice echoed in her mind, and a thought slowly began to form. How much longer can I take this? Every task felt like a marathon, every comment like a stone thrown in her direction. The feeling of helplessness grew inside her, but at the same time, something else was starting to emerge, a determination not to submit anymore. As the day dragged on, the hours seemed to stretch endlessly. By late afternoon, Arthur walked past her desk, eyeing the scattered papers. He looked at her with a cold smile. "Did you manage to finish everything?" he asked, not really expecting a positive answer. He knew it wasn't possible. Camila stared at him. For a moment, she thought about telling him the truth, confronting him once and for all. But something made her hold back. She knew that, at that moment, she didn't have enough strength to defeat him. Not yet. So she just shook her head, defeated. Arthur chuckled and walked away, leaving her with the unfinished task and a bitter sense of failure. But deep down, a small spark of determination was beginning to ignite. The clock in the corner of Camila's desk showed it was past 10 p.m. The office was nearly empty, yet she was still there, typing frantically to finish the report Arthur had demanded by the next day. The harsh fluorescent lights cast tired shadows on her face. Her eyes burned, her body begged for rest, but she couldn't stop. In recent months, Arthur's demands had turned into pure torture. Every time he walked into the office, her stomach twisted in knots. No matter how hard she worked, he always found something to criticize. Camila knew he was setting her up to fail. He gave her nearly impossible tasks and waited for her to slip. Even the smallest mistake became a reason for Arthur to publicly humiliate her. Last week he had called an emergency meeting. Camila had barely finished reviewing the material he had asked for when he started publicly tearing apart her work. "This is wrong, Camila. What happened here? Trouble understanding basic numbers?" He sneered sarcastically. "Maybe you need some time to brush up on your fundamentals." The silence in the room was thick. None of her colleagues dared to say a word, though some looked visibly uncomfortable. Others, however, seemed relieved not to be in her shoes. It was a ritual for Arthur. Choose a target and wear them down until they quit. But Camila still resisted. She felt the weight of the humiliation and the crushing workload, but something inside her refused to give in. Despite her fragile confidence, she knew that if she gave up, it would give Arthur the satisfaction of seeing her broken. However, this decision to keep going came at a high price. Her nights of sleep were getting shorter and more restless. Anxiety had become her constant companion. Her heart raced every time Arthur called her into his office, and her palms would sweat at the mere thought of the meetings where he consistently put her on display. "I need to get out of here," Camila thought more and more as she stared at the endless spreadsheets on her computer screen. But at the same time, the fear of financial uncertainty held her back. There were bills to pay, commitments to keep. The fear of not finding another job quickly enough to support herself was suffocating. That week, Arthur sank even lower. He called her into his office and with a false tone of concern said, "Camila, I've noticed you've been trying hard, but it seems like you're not keeping up with the company's demands. This is affecting the team's performance. Maybe you should consider whether this is really the right environment for you." He gave her that cold stare, the one that disguised the pleasure he took in her pain. Camila took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the humiliation. She knew he was trying to push her to quit, and that only fueled her inner rebellion. But Arthur didn't stop there. "You know, sometimes it's important to recognize our limits. Some people just don't fit," he said with a shrug, feigning understanding. "And the pressure for results can be too much for some. Maybe a less demanding area would be better for you." Camila's heart raced with anger. She knew exactly what he was insinuating, but at that moment, she still couldn't confront him. She felt like she was walking through a minefield, where every word or gesture could be used against her. The frustration burned inside, but on the outside, she remained still, trying not to show how deeply those words hurt. She left the office without responding, swallowing the urge to scream. The hallway seemed longer than usual as she struggled to keep her composure. Camila felt like she was on the verge of collapse. The sleepless nights and constant emotional abuse were wearing her down. She couldn't focus on anything other than work and the fear of failing again. And that's exactly what Arthur wanted, for her to be consumed by exhaustion. Her co-workers noticed what was happening, but silence prevailed. No one dared to interfere, afraid of becoming the next target. Even those who had initially shown sympathy now avoided making eye contact with her in the hallways. It was clear that, for everyone, it was safer to watch from a distance than to take any action. At home, Camila's anxiety attacks worsened. Arthur's tactics were working. Every night she slept less. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, thinking about the impossible deadlines and constant humiliations. Her mind couldn't rest, always anticipating the next criticism, the next failure he would point out with that smug smile. Arthur's words echoed in her mind like a destructive mantra. "You can't keep up. You don't belong here. Maybe you should quit." She wanted to scream, she wanted to fight back. But she couldn't. The oppression she felt at work had seeped into every part of her life. She began isolating herself from friends and family, avoiding conversations that involved her job. When people asked how she was, she gave automatic responses. "I'm fine. Just busy." But inside she was falling apart. In the following weeks, things only got worse. Arthur found new ways to torment her. During a meeting, he pretended he hadn't received an important report she had submitted days earlier, blaming her for delaying the entire project. "I told you, everyone. We need people who actually deliver what they promise," he said, without even looking at her, while the rest of the room sat in uncomfortable silence. Camila wanted to scream, wanted to show the proof, but she knew that any attempt at confrontation would be useless at that point. He had the upper hand, and she knew it. The cycle of abuse seemed endless. Every day, Camila felt like another piece of herself was being chipped away. She worked late into the night, sacrificed her mental health, but it never seemed to be enough. Arthur was draining her, not just physically, but emotionally, with a relentless cruelty. But amid the darkness, a spark still remained. Camila didn't know how, but something inside her refused to be completely broken. As much as Arthur tried to destroy her, she was still there, fighting to survive in that toxic environment. And slowly, an idea began to form. She didn't know how or when, but she wasn't going to leave this situation defeated. Time seemed to crawl for Camila. Every day at the office felt like an endless battle. The glances from her colleagues, which once carried a hint of sympathy, now avoided her entirely. Arthur had succeeded in his mission. Camila was completely isolated. Everyone on the team knew that showing any support for her could make them the next target. So, instead of helping, they chose silence. The mornings were the worst. Camila woke up each day already feeling the weight of anxiety. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was in a constant state of alert. Walking into the office felt like stepping into a suffocating atmosphere. She could feel eyes on her, as if she was being judged with every move she made. Even the fake smiles from her coworkers had disappeared. She was utterly alone. Arthur, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy the situation. He passed by her desk multiple times a day, making venomous remarks. On one such occasion, while she was focused on a report, he stopped beside her desk and glanced at her scattered papers. "Everything okay over here, Camila? I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. Not everyone can handle the pressure, you know," he said. His cruel smile now a regular feature in her nightmares. She didn't respond. She knew that any word she said could be twisted and used against her. Instead, she kept typing, trying to focus on her work. But inside, the anger and frustration boiled. Arthur had managed to push her out of important projects. He now assigned her only repetitive and meaningless tasks, as if he wanted to make her invisible within the team. And it was working. At the last team meeting, her name wasn't even mentioned, as if she weren't there. Camila, who had once been a key player in developing campaigns, was now treated like an assistant, someone to whom the most insignificant tasks were delegated. The isolation was crushing. Her co-workers, who used to chat with her during breaks, now pretended not to see her. Coffee breaks had become moments of loneliness. She started leaving the office during quieter times, just to avoid the embarrassment of being alone while everyone else mingled in groups. One day, Camila was sitting alone in the cafeteria, tucked away in a corner, when she overheard two colleagues whispering at the next table. She couldn't help but hear their conversation. "Did you hear what Arthur said about Camila?" One of them whispered. "He said she won't last long here. Maybe her profile isn't really suited for the corporate environment, you know," the other replied, emphasizing the insinuation. Camila's chest tightened. She knew exactly what they meant. Arthur was always careful not to be openly racist, but his insinuations were always there. He didn't have to say it outright. The racism was there, implied in every gesture, every cruel joke, every disdainful glance. And now it was spreading to others. Camila left the cafeteria before anyone could see her, fighting back tears. She was mentally exhausted, and the isolation only made it worse. She no longer knew who she could trust. Everyone around her seemed to be on Arthur's side, or at least preferred not to get involved. In the days that followed, Camila tried to focus on her work, but she felt more and more like she was losing the battle. The isolation was consuming her. No one spoke to her anymore, except when absolutely necessary. She had become invisible, exactly as Arthur wanted. Her work went unnoticed, her ideas were no longer asked for, and any effort she made was quickly erased by the lack of recognition. Even outside of work, Camila began to withdraw from people. When friends tried to make plans or family members asked how she was doing, she made excuses. She didn't want to admit to anyone what was happening. She felt weak, defeated. It was as if all the effort she had put in over the years to get to this point had been in vain. She was being pushed out, and the worst part was that no one seemed to care. Her anxiety attacks became more frequent. At night she could barely sleep. When she finally did, she would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, thinking about the impossible tasks and the humiliation she would likely face the next day. Her body couldn't take it anymore. The lack of sleep and the constant stress were starting to take a toll on her health. Her eyes were always puffy, her body felt heavy, but even so, she kept going. Part of Camila still resisted. Despite all the pain, she refused to give up. Arthur wanted her to quit, to leave quietly, as if she had failed. But Camila didn't want to give him that satisfaction. As hurt as she was, as much as the isolation was wearing her down, she knew that if she gave up, he would win. And she couldn't let that happen. One afternoon, as she worked alone in the office, Arthur approached her again. This time he seemed more relaxed, almost satisfied. "You know, Camila," he started, pulling up a chair and sitting next to her. "Sometimes it's better to know when to stop. I'm not saying you should leave, but I think we all know this environment isn't for everyone. Maybe you'll find a place where your profile fits better." He smiled, almost kindly, but his words were sharp as knives. It was clear he wanted her to quit, to give up the fight. And for the first time in weeks, something inside Camila sparked. She looked directly into Arthur's eyes, feeling a surge of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Anger, yes, but also a small spark of determination. She didn't know what she would do next or how, but at that moment, she decided she wasn't going to leave without a fight. Arthur left the room, believing he had planted the seed of resignation. But Camila, despite all the pain and isolation, was starting to see things differently. Perhaps it was time to turn the tables, but not in the way Arthur expected. Camila knew it would be a tough day, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. Early that morning, Arthur called an impromptu meeting with the company's executives. She had little time to prepare the materials, but as always, she did her best to deliver something solid and well-structured. She knew that any mistake, no matter how small, would be used against her. When she entered the conference room, she found Arthur already seated beside some of the directors. His cold, calculating smile unsettled her deeply. He seemed relaxed, as if he already knew the outcome of the meeting before it had even begun. Camila sat at the back of the room, far from the judgmental gazes that always followed her. The meeting began, and as expected, Arthur took the lead on the presentation. He spoke about the team's recent results and how the company was thriving in the market, attributing all the success to himself. However, when it came time to present ideas for the next project, he handed the floor to Camila. She swallowed hard, tried to steady her breathing, and began presenting her ideas. For the next quarter, I believe we should focus on strategies that engage the younger audience, with campaigns geared more towards social media. Camila began, trying to sound confident. But before she could continue, Arthur interrupted, as he always did. Interesting, but do you think we have the infrastructure for that? He asked with a tone dripping with disdain. I'm not sure you really understand our audience's profile. We need to be cautious with rash ideas. The room fell silent. Camila tried to stay calm, but she could feel the weight of the stares. She knew that any response could be twisted, so she tried to push forward. Yes, Arthur, I believe that with the right resources, we can make a smooth transition. I've outlined some budget allocation suggestions for this, she replied, attempting to demonstrate that she had control over the situation. Arthur smiled, but not in a kind way. He leaned forward in his chair, as if preparing to deliver the final blow. I understand, Camila, but the issue here is whether you're really qualified to propose this type of strategy. His voice was laced with condescension. I mean, you've done a decent job with the simpler tasks, but maybe we should leave this kind of planning to someone with more experience. He said it so casually that for a moment, it almost seemed well-intentioned. The directors, visibly uncomfortable, exchanged glances, but none of them intervened. No one dared challenge Arthur directly. He was respected, or perhaps feared, and it was clear he held absolute power in that room. Camila felt the ground beneath her feet crumbling. Then came the lowest blow. In fact, we need to consider that not everyone here has the right profile for strategic decisions. Arthur said this, looking directly at her. Sometimes, opportunities are given for reasons other than competence. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, heavy with insinuation. The impact of Arthur's words was devastating. He was insinuating that Camila was there because of diversity or quotas, not because of her own merit. The silence in the room was deafening. The directors, clearly embarrassed, avoided any reaction. No one seemed willing to confront him or defend Camila. It was as if she didn't exist, as if those words hadn't been spoken right in front of her. Camila felt her chest tighten. Her hands trembled beneath the table, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. Her blood boiled with rage. She wanted to scream, to tell everyone how that man humiliated her day after day. But she couldn't. She was trapped in a cruel game where any wrong move could mean the end of her career. She scanned the room, searching for any sign of support, but found only faces that avoided her gaze. Once again, she was alone. The humiliation was public, brutal. With every word Arthur spoke, she felt her dignity being crushed, and the anger inside her grew uncontrollably. When the meeting finally ended, Camila could barely breathe. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry in front of everyone. She quickly gathered her things and rushed out of the room, feeling the weight of their eyes on her back. Her steps were fast, almost frantic, as she hurried to the bathroom. Locking herself in one of the stalls, she allowed herself to cry for the first time in weeks. But it wasn't just sadness. It was a mix of humiliation, anger, and frustration. She felt utterly defeated. Each encounter with Arthur intensified her sense of powerlessness. He demoralized her, undermined her confidence, and treated her as if her very presence in the company was a mistake. The impact of that public humiliation was profound, and Camila knew this was all part of his plan to force her to resign. He wanted to see her leave, broken. But something shifted within Camila that day. Amidst the tears and the pain, a new strength began to emerge. As she sat there alone in the bathroom, something inside her awakened. For the first time, she realized she could no longer allow this to continue. She couldn't accept being treated this way, as if she had no worth. She wiped her tears with newfound resolve. She wouldn't give Arthur the pleasure of seeing her leave without a fight. If he thought he could break her, he was wrong. In that moment, Camila decided she would turn the tables. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she knew she had to be stronger than she had ever been before. As she stepped out of the bathroom, she looked down the hallway of the office with a new perspective. Something had changed inside her. Camila would no longer be a passive victim. From that moment on, she would start plotting her path to revenge. And this time, she would be the one in control. Camila left the office that afternoon feeling different. The sting of public humiliation in the meeting still burned in her mind, but something had shifted inside her. For the first time in months, she didn't feel utterly defeated. The fear and insecurity had given way to a new emotion: determination. She knew she couldn't continue to let Arthur trample over her. Something had to change, and this time she wasn't going to wait for change to come from outside. It was time to take control of her own life. In the weeks that followed, Camila began to execute a plan. It wouldn't be fast nor easy, but she knew she had to start building her own support network within the company. She had been isolated for too long, and Arthur had used that against her. Now she would use the same game, but this time in her favor. She began observing the other departments more closely. She knew there were others in the company who, like her, had been marginalized or underestimated. Camila decided to approach a senior executive from another department, Dr. Regina, a strong and determined woman known for having risen through the ranks on merit, overcoming obstacles much like the ones Camila was facing now. Camila started attending more internal company events, conferences, talks, and meetings that could expand her network. At one of these events, she got the opportunity to introduce herself to Dr. Regina. Camila knew she had to present herself confidently, so during a coffee break, she approached her. "Hello, Dr. Regina, I'm Camila. I work in the marketing team under Arthur," she said, her stomach churning at the mention of her boss's name. Regina looked at Camila with a cordial smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Camila. I've heard quite a bit about the marketing team lately. How are things going over there?" she asked with interest. Camila hesitated for a moment. She knew she couldn't reveal too much yet, but also couldn't miss the chance to plant the seed for a potential alliance. "We've been facing some challenges, but I believe there's a lot of potential for growth. I have some ideas for new projects that could help the company position itself better in the market," Camila said, trying to sound firm. Regina raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "That's great. We're always open to good ideas. You should tell me more about them sometime," she responded, making it clear that there was an opportunity there. Camila seized the moment. In the following days, she began sending polite emails to Dr. Regina, sharing some of her project ideas and initiatives. Slowly, she started receiving responses, advice, and even invitations to smaller meetings where she could present her ideas without Arthur's oppressive filter. As she nurtured this new relationship, Camila's confidence grew. She knew that, over time, she could earn the respect of influential people in the company, building her own network of allies. She still faced Arthur's daily attacks, but something had changed. She was no longer alone. And Arthur didn't yet realize what was coming. At the same time, Camila invested in her own development. She enrolled in online leadership and management courses, sharpening her skills during the few hours left between work and exhaustion. She dedicated her nights and weekends to learning more about business strategy, finance, and anything that could give her an edge at the right moment. She knew that to face Arthur on equal footing, she would need to be prepared. Meanwhile, Arthur continued his crusade to crush Camila. He kept her on minor tasks, limiting her access to important projects in an attempt to render her irrelevant. But Camila began to realize that, outside of Arthur's radar, there was room to grow. When he wasn't paying attention, she kept making contacts and quietly building her reputation. A few weeks later, the company announced a major promotion opportunity. A new mid-level management position was open. This role would give the person who filled it significant influence in the company's strategic decisions. It was a golden opportunity, and Camila knew she was qualified for the job. But she also knew Arthur would try to block her. When the announcement was made, Arthur called Camila into his office. "Camila, I heard you're thinking about applying for the management position," he said with a fake smile, shuffling papers on his desk. "I know you've been trying hard, but I'm not sure this is the right move for you at this time. That role requires a lot of leadership experience, and you've been struggling to manage your own projects lately, don't you think?" Rage flared inside her, But Camila kept her composure. She knew Arthur was trying to undermine her confidence. She wouldn't fall into his trap. "I believe I can contribute a lot to the company in this position. I've been preparing for it," she responded with a firmness that surprised even herself. Arthur studied her for a few moments, as if assessing her strength. Then he shrugged, pretending not to care. "As you wish, Camila. I just hope you know what you're getting into." He smiled, but this time there was a hint of threat in his voice. Camila left the office with her heart racing. Arthur was clearly determined to do everything he could to block her rise. But now she had something he didn't know: allies. Dr. Regina, who was now openly supporting her, guided her through the application process. Camila meticulously prepared for every step, and with the support of Regina and other contacts she had built, she managed to impress the executives in charge of the decision. Even with Arthur trying to sabotage her chances behind the scenes, she had grown strong enough to withstand his efforts. When the final decision was announced, Camila could hardly believe it. She had done it. She was the new mid-level manager, in a position higher than Arthur's. The shock on Arthur's face was unmistakable the day the announcement was made. Arthur, who had always prided himself on his control over the team, watched as Camila took on a role he never thought she would achieve. For the first time, Camila felt the balance of power shifting. This was just the first victory. From that moment on, the dynamic between them had changed forever. Camila still couldn't believe what had happened. Her promotion to mid-level manager had been officially announced, and the sense of victory was overwhelming. Years of humiliation, sacrifice, and silent battles were finally being rewarded. The look of shock and disbelief on Arthur's face when he learned of her promotion was one of the most gratifying moments Camila had ever experienced. She had overcome every obstacle he had placed in her path. But Camila knew that this victory wouldn't be enough on its own. Arthur still held a position of influence within the company, and the tension between them had reached new heights. Now that he knew he could no longer control her as he had before, he had become even more dangerous. He would look for ways to sabotage her in more subtle and insidious ways, and Camila was ready for that. In the weeks following her promotion, Arthur tried to keep his distance, but his disdain was visible in every interaction. He attempted to maintain a professional demeanor, but it was clear that resentment was growing within him. However, he hadn't realized how precarious his position was becoming. Now that Camila had more influence and allies within the company, she began to closely monitor Arthur's work. She knew he was clever, but she also knew that he made mistakes. The first opportunity to weaken Arthur came when Camila was assigned to oversee a major project for the company, one that Arthur had been leading. It was a multi-million-dollar contract with an important client, and Camila's role was to supervise the project's execution. As she began reviewing the documents, she noticed several irregularities that Arthur had overlooked. It seemed that he had been negligent with certain aspects of the contract, putting the company's relationship with the client at risk. Camila knew she had to proceed carefully. She didn't want to appear vengeful or impulsive. Instead, she meticulously documented every mistake. She gathered all the data, prepared a comprehensive report, and began working with her team to fix the issues before they could cause any significant damage to the company. Meanwhile, Arthur, still bitter about his defeat, continued to try to undermine Camila behind the scenes. He spread rumors that she wasn't qualified for the position, claiming that her promotion had been motivated by political reasons rather than merit. However, Arthur's efforts were beginning to lose traction. Camila, with her flawless work and the growing trust of her superiors, was solidifying her reputation as a competent and respected leader. Even some of Arthur's own allies started to notice that he was losing control. His behavior was becoming erratic, and with Camila now in a position of power, the fear he once inspired was beginning to fade. People were more willing to cooperate with her, and Arthur was becoming increasingly isolated. Then came the pivotal moment. The contract that Camila had reviewed was brought up in an important meeting with the executive board. Camila, armed with all the corrections and solutions, presented her report clearly and objectively. The directors were impressed with her attention to detail and the way she had managed the crisis. That's when Arthur, trying to salvage his prestige, attempted to assert himself. "Camila did a good job," he said, forcing a smile. "But let's not forget that I've been leading this project from the beginning. Most of the processes were already in place before she came on board, so the majority of the credit should go to my team." Camila remained calm. She knew Arthur would try to twist the situation, but she also knew she had the truth on her side. With a firm but respectful tone, she responded, "Yes, Arthur, your team was involved in the project, but there were several inconsistencies that needed correction. It's important to note that these issues could have caused significant losses for the company if they hadn't been addressed in time." She then presented the specific errors she had found, demonstrating how her intervention had prevented serious problems. The room fell silent. The directors exchanged glances, visibly surprised. Arthur, on the other hand, looked like he had lost his breath. He tried to argue, but it was obvious that the mistakes were undeniable, and the board wasn't going to overlook the risks he had allowed to slip by. From that moment, it became clear that his authority had been shaken. After the meeting, Camila was called into the CEO's office. The company's CEO, who had always stayed above the internal politics, asked her to sit down. "Camila, I have to congratulate you on your excellent work. You've demonstrated a level of competence that few achieve so quickly in a new role," said the CEO, his expression serious. "But I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe Arthur is still the right person to lead his team?" Camila knew this was a critical moment. It was her chance to finally confront Arthur more directly, but she had to do it the right way. She took a deep breath before answering. "He has experience, but I believe the company needs leadership that aligns with values of responsibility and integrity. Over the past few months, I've seen several failures that could have been avoided with more care and attention," she said, keeping her tone professional. The CEO nodded, considering her words. "We'll continue to monitor the situation. But for now, keep up the excellent work." Camila left the CEO's office knowing that she had planted the seed of doubt about Arthur in the minds of the company's leadership. Arthur was beginning to sink, and she knew that soon he would face the consequences of his own mistakes. The atmosphere in the office had shifted. Since Camila had assumed her role as mid-level manager, the echoes of Arthur's abusive behavior had started to fade. But Camila knew this was only the beginning. Arthur still clung to his position, but his authority was crumbling slowly. The failures she exposed in the previous meeting, along with her impeccable work, had begun to weaken his standing in the company. The next step would be her final revenge, and this time it would be impossible for him to escape. Camila had everything she needed: documents, witness statements, and evidence that clearly showed how Arthur not only sabotaged his colleagues but maintained a racist and toxic attitude in the workplace. Her plan was in motion, and now it was just a matter of time before he was publicly exposed. The perfect opportunity arose when the company announced an internal audit to evaluate the performance of team leaders. It was the ideal moment to expose Arthur. Camila, with the support of Dr. Regina and other company leaders, prepared a detailed report on Arthur's behavior over the years, including incidents of racism and sabotage, many of which had been carefully documented by her and other employees. But that wasn't enough. Camila knew she needed something more impactful to ensure Arthur had no way out. That's when she remembered a conversation she had with a former colleague who had worked with Arthur before she joined the company. He had mentioned that Arthur often made racist remarks in more informal meetings, always careful not to leave a written trail. Camila contacted this colleague and managed to obtain a formal statement describing the racist incidents he had witnessed. With this, her case became even stronger. In the week of the audit, Camila moved with surgical precision. She presented her evidence to the audit committee and simultaneously filed a formal complaint of racism with Human Resources. It was the first time Arthur had faced such a serious accusation, and he was unprepared for what was about to come. During the audit, Arthur tried to maintain his arrogant demeanor, but when confronted with the evidence, his composure began to crumble. First came the questions about the project failures that Camila had corrected. He tried to defend himself, But the evidence was undeniable. Camila had saved the contract, and Arthur had nearly caused a multimillion-dollar loss for the company. The directors were already looking at him with suspicion. Then came the final blow. "Arthur, in addition to these performance issues, we've received a formal complaint against you involving racist behavior and abuse of power in the workplace," said the head of the committee, staring directly at him. Arthur paled. He wasn't prepared for this. He tried to stammer something but was interrupted. "We have documented evidence and testimonies from colleagues detailing clear episodes of racial discrimination. The behavior you've maintained for so long can no longer be ignored." The auditor's tone was firm and unyielding. Camila watched from afar, observing as Arthur tried in vain to defend himself. He denied everything, claimed it was a conspiracy against him, and accused Camila of fabricating the allegations to destroy him. But the evidence was too clear, and for the first time in years people were ready to speak up. Colleagues who had been silenced by fear finally came forward, corroborating Arthur's abusive behavior. The company had no choice. By the end of the week, Arthur was called into a meeting with the CEO and the directors. He was informed that he was being terminated for cause, and the company would be forwarding the evidence of his racist behavior to the appropriate authorities. In addition to losing his job, Arthur would now face legal charges for racism, a serious crime in Brazil. The news of his dismissal was a shock to many employees, but for Camila, it marked the culmination of a long journey of resistance. Arthur, who had spent years humiliating and disrespecting his colleagues, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. On the day of his dismissal, Arthur was called into the CEO's office. When he emerged, rumors quickly spread. He was escorted to the door by company security, his face a mask of utter despair. The humiliation he had inflicted on so many for so long now came crashing down on him. Arthur was no longer the ruthless and untouchable boss. He was now a broken man, exposed and ruined. But Camila's revenge wasn't just about destroying Arthur's career. She had also ensured that he would face legal repercussions for his racist actions. With a formal complaint submitted to the public prosecutor's office, Arthur was summoned to testify and was later charged with racism. The case gained public attention, and soon the media began reporting on it. Arthur went from a powerful boss to a defendant accused of a serious crime, and his reputation was completely destroyed. For Camila, the victory was complete. Not only had she managed to rebuild her career and earn the respect of her colleagues, but she had also ensured that justice was served. Arthur would pay for everything he had done, and she made sure it would serve as a warning to anyone who might try to perpetuate similar behaviors in the workplace. In the days that followed, Camila felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew there was still much work to be done, that the fight against racism and inequality would continue, but for now she could breathe easy. She had won. The days following Arthur's downfall were marked by a sense of liberation that Camila had never felt before. The office, once a minefield of tension and fear, began to change. Without the oppressive shadow of Arthur, the employees seemed more at ease, and the team's energy was renewed. Camila, now in her new leadership position, felt the weight of her responsibility, but also the pride of having survived it all. Yet, the true victory was still to come. Arthur was now facing the legal consequences of his racist actions, and the news of his dismissal and criminal charges had spread in the media. His case became a symbol of how racism in the workplace would no longer be tolerated, and his imprisonment was only a matter of time. One day, while Camila was in her office reviewing reports, a call from Dr. Regina interrupted her. "Camila, I have good news. The public prosecutor's office has officially charged Arthur, and he's been convicted. He's going to serve time for racism," Regina informed her, her voice calm yet filled with satisfaction. Camila closed her eyes for a moment, letting Regina's words sink in. She had known that Arthur would face justice, but hearing the confirmation brought an indescribable sense of closure. All the suffering, the humiliations, the sleepless nights, it had all been worth it. "This is an important day, Camila. What you did wasn't just for you. But for everyone who faces this kind of oppression every day, Regina added, her voice tinged with pride. I know, Regina. And that's what keeps me going, Camila replied, smiling as she looked out the window of her office. The sun shone brightly outside, reflecting the new chapter her life had taken. The news of Arthur's conviction spread quickly throughout the company. Colleagues who had previously stayed silent, afraid of retaliation, now felt inspired by Camila's courage. Slowly, other employees who had also been victims of discrimination or abuse began to come forward. Camila's example sparked a wave of complaints and change within the company, which, under new leadership, began adopting stricter policies against racism and discrimination. Camila was invited to speak at various conferences and events on diversity and inclusion, where she could share her story and inspire others. At each event, she was met with warm applause and looks of admiration. Her journey, once marked by pain and humiliation, was now seen as a story of strength, courage, and triumph. At one of these events, Camila was invited to speak at a major corporate conference, where leaders and executives from across the country had gathered. As she took the stage, she looked out at the packed auditorium and took a deep breath. This wasn't just an opportunity to tell her story, but to show that the fight against racism was ongoing and that justice could be achieved if one had the courage to pursue it. For a long time I stayed silent. I suffered in silence, believing there was no way out. But what I learned from this journey is that justice only happens when we have the courage to fight for it. Racism is a deep wound, manifesting in subtle and painful ways. But silence only perpetuates that wound, Camila began, her voice steady, resonating throughout the auditorium. She looked at the audience, seeing the attentive faces, absorbing her story. I didn't fight just for myself. I fought for every person who has been silenced, humiliated, or disrespected because of the color of their skin. I fought because no one deserves to live in fear or shame for who they are. And today, seeing that Arthur has been convicted and justice has been served, I feel that, in some way, that wound is starting to heal. But our fight doesn't end here, she continued, her voice rising with emotion. The audience erupted into applause, and for a moment, Camila closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the weight of that recognition. Her battle had been long and painful, but the reward was far greater than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about her personal rise or her revenge on Arthur. It was about something bigger: justice for all those who, like her, had suffered in silence. As she stepped down from the stage, she was surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her, take pictures, or simply share their own stories. Camila knew there was still much work to be done, but she felt strengthened by the victory she had achieved and the positive impact her fight had made. Back at the office, the transformation was clear. The company had adopted new diversity policies, and Camila was leading an inclusion committee that promoted training and discussions on racism, gender, and equality. The environment, once toxic and oppressive, had become a space where people felt valued and heard. Arthur, meanwhile, was serving his sentence. He had lost everything: his prestige, his job, and his freedom. The man who once humiliated and oppressed others now faced the legal and social consequences of his actions. Camila knew that, in a way, he had sealed his own fate by underestimating her for so long. In the months that followed, peace and satisfaction finally became part of Camila's life. She walked through the company's halls with her head held high, knowing that her presence there was not only the result of her competence, but also of her courage to fight for what was right. One day, as she was reviewing reports, a young employee approached her shyly. "Camila, I just wanted to say that your story really inspires me. I never thought I could grow here, but after everything you've done, I feel like there's hope." "Thank you for that," he said with a sincere smile. Camila smiled back. "Never give up. Sometimes the fight is tough, but justice always comes for those who have the courage to face it," she replied, knowing she had fulfilled her mission. And so, with the past finally laid to rest and the future full of possibilities, Camila moved forward, knowing that her journey of triumph had become a beacon of hope and strength for everyone around her.